My perspective on this is maybe closest to George's, of how I'm coming out. And I liked his introducing himself as being interested in intelligence in the wild. And I will copy that. I think that is actually what I'm interested in too. But it's with a perspective that maybe makes it all in the wild. I see my interest in AI really comes from a broader interest in what I think is a much more interesting question, which I have no answers to and can barely articulate the question. But it's how lots of simple things interacting emerge into something more complicated, and then that then creates the next system out of which that happens, and so on. And so it's the phenomenon, for instance, chemicals organizing themselves into life, or single cellular things organizing themselves into multicellular organism, or individual people organizing themselves into society with language and things like that. And I suspect that there's more of that organization to happen. I think the AI that I'm interested in is a higher level of that. And I suspect that, like George, I suspect that not only it will happen, but it probably already is happening, and we're going to have a lot of trouble perceiving it as it happens. And partly I think we have trouble perceiving it because the notion that Ian so beautifully described of this sort of the golem, or that's such a compelling idea that I think we get distracted by it and we imagine it to be like that. And that kind of blinds us to being able to see it as it really is emerging. Not that I think such things are impossible, but I just don't think those are going to be the first to emerge. And I know that there's a pattern in all of those emergences, which is really interesting, which is that they do start out as analog systems of interaction. And then somehow, like the chemicals, have chains of circular pathways that, metabolize stuff from the outside world and turn it into this circular pathways that are metabolizing. And then what happens always is the going up to the next level is somehow those sort of analog systems invent a digital system, like DNA, where they sort of abstract out the information processing. So they put the information processing kind of in a separate system of its own. And then from then on, the interesting story becomes the story in the information processing rather than the story. In some sense, the information processing system starts to drag along the complexity happens more in the information processing system. And so that certainly happens again with multicellular organisms. The information processing system is neurons, and they eventually go from just, a bunch of cells to having this special information processing system, and then that's where the action is in the brains and behavior, and that allows, it drags along, makes much more complicated bodies much more interesting once you have behavior. And of course it makes humans much more interesting when they invent language and can start talking to, but that's a way of externalizing the information processing. In fact, as we build communications writing first, and that's sort of our form of DNA for culture in some sense. It's this digital form that we invent for encoding knowledge, and then we start building machinery to do information processing, systems, and everything from legal systems to communication systems and computers and things like that. So I sort of see that as a repeat pattern. I wish I could say that more precisely, but I think you all know what I'm talking about when I wave my hands in that direction. I think it'd be, somebody will someday make wonderful progress in finding a way of talking about that more precisely. But if you apply that to artificial intelligence and look at it. Let me take your springing off point of things beginning. I think there's a worry that the singularity people are, is that somehow the artificial intelligence will become super powerful and develop goals of its own that aren't the same as ours. And so one thing that I'd like to convince you of is that I believe that's actually started to happen already. And that we do have intelligences that are super powerful in some senses, not in every way, in some dimensions much more powerful than we are, and other dimensions much weaker. But the interesting thing about them is I think they are already developing emergent goals of their own that are not well aligned necessarily with our goals, with the goals of the people that created them, with the goals of the people that they influence, with the goals of the people that feed them and sustain them, and so on. Goals of the people that own them. And I think that those early intelligences, they're probably not conscious. So the examples are, it may be that there's one lurking inside Google or something. I can't perceive that, but Google is one. So corporations are examples. Nation states are examples. And so corporations they're hybrid intelligence. They're actually artificial bodies. That's what the word means, right? They're artificial entities that are constructed to serve us. But in fact, what happens is that they don't really end up serving exactly the founders. They don't really serve the shareholders. They don't really it's not really the employees that they serve. It's not really their customers that they serve. They kind of have a life of their own. In fact, none of those entities that are their constituents actually have control over them. And I think that's a very fundamental reason why they don't. I think it's, Ashby's law of requisite variety that, he basically says, in order to control something, you sort of have to have as many states as the thing you're controlling. And therefore, these super complicated super intelligences, by definition, are not controllable by individuals. And certainly, you might imagine that, the head of, Google actually gets to decide what Google does, especially since they're the founder of Google. But, if you talk to Larry and Sergey, you'll realize, they're pretty out of control of the whole thing. And they're not unique in that respect. I mean, when you really talk to, heads of state or things like that, mostly they feel powerless. And even if they're in the positions of great power, they don't feel as powerful as they are imagined. Yes.
They don't necessarily feel in control of what's
they don't feel in control. They certainly don't feel in control of what's going on. And they constantly express frustration that people imagine that I can solve this problem. I see this problem, but I can't solve it, even though I nominally. So they're not powerless. They're not purely powerless. That was an overstatement. And and of course, shareholders try to influence and do influence corporations, but they have limited influence. So people inside companies try to influence them and so on. But one of the interesting things about the emergence of them having goals of their own, the emergent goals, is the emergent goals often tend to successfully see those influences as sources of noise or something like that. So for example, before information technology, corporations couldn't get very big because they just couldn't hold together. So you couldn't have sort of world-spanning corporations that as effectively...
East India Company.
I'm sorry, what?
East India Company.
So
China's what you were saying. Is
I would say that East India Company did not as effectively hold together as an entity and stay coordinated. I mean, they can be big, but I don't think that they were as tightly coupled.
But they stopped going bigger partly because of antitrust laws, right? Standard Oil was going to be.
But by the way, by information technology, I think certainly it made it much easier. I won't quibble with you whether they were edge cases, but certainly, Yeah, certainly, having the telegraph and the telephone and things like that, you could have skyscrapers full of people that did nothing but hold the corporation together by calling up other people in the corporation. And so these things are hybrids of technology and people. But one of the things that they do is before the technology could enforce, as they shifted over to have more and more of the decisions being done by the technology, one thing they can do is prevent the people from breaking the rules. So it used to be that, if an individual employee could just decide not to apply the policy, the company policy or something like that because it didn't make sense or it wasn't kind or something like that. Then that's getting harder and harder to do because more and more of the machines actually have the policy coded into it and they literally can't solve your problem even if they want to. So I think that we've actually got to the point where we do have these super powerful things that do have big influences on our lives. And let me give you an example of sort of emergent behavior. We just had, and they're interacting with each other. So the stories that are happening, like let's say the Facebook is a great example. There's an emergent property of Facebook that it basically enabling conspiracy theory groups. Now, it wasn't that Zuckerberg decided to do that or anybody at Facebook decided to do that. That just kind of emerged out of, what their business model was and so on. And then that actually had an impact on, this sort of other emergent thing, which was the government, which was designed for dealing with people, not corporations. But in fact, corporations have learned to hack it. And they've learned that they can use their superhuman ability to track details to things like lobby and track details of bills going through Congress in ways that no individuals can. And so they can influence government in ways that individuals can't. So they're more and more, the government is responding actually to the pressures of corporations more successfully than the pressures of people because they're sort of superhuman in their ability to do that, even though they may be very dumb in some other ways. Well, that is an example, though, of their success, which is that one of their successes is their ability to gather resources to get food from the outside world, and so they have been extremely successful at gathering resources to themselves, which gives them more power. So there's a positive feedback loop there, which lets them invest in quantum computers and AI and so on, which gets them presumably richer and better. And so I think we may be already in a world where we have this kind of a runaway situation, which is not necessarily aligned with our individual human goals. And I think, people are perceiving it, they're perceiving aspects of it, but I don't think it's widely perceived what's happening. What's happening is that we have these emergent intelligences. So for me, I think when I hear people do kind of the hypothetical hand-wringing of these super intelligent AIs that are, going to take over the world, I'm like, well, that might happen sometime in the future, but we actually kind of have a real example now. And if we could just figure out how to control those things, rather than thinking sort of hypothetically how we ought to, design the 5 laws of robotics into these hypothetical general AI sort of human-like things, let's actually think, how can we design the 5 laws of robotics or computers into corporations or something like that? We ought to be able to do that. Ought to be an easier job. If we could actually do that, we ought to be able to apply that right now.
5 laws of online
Yeah, or something like that. But I think I think this is not just a metaphor. I think this is actually a serious, literal problem.
One example of that is what rights do they have?
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court recently said they have the right of free speech, which means they can contribute to political campaigns.
The historian, I don't know if you know this, but the historian David Runciman found out about this just because he was giving a talk at NIPS, who's a historian at Cambridge, has made exactly this argument, exactly about corporations and nation states. But he's made the argument, which I think is quite convincing, that this is from the origin of corporations and nation states, that it's from industrialization, that's when you start getting these agents. And then there's some questions you could ask about whether you had analogous super individual agents early on. So maybe, just having a forager group is already having a forager community is already having a super intelligence compared to the individual members of the community. And it's fairly clear that kind of increased social complexity is very, very deeply related to some of the things that we more typically think of as being intelligences. So we actually have a historical example of those things appearing and those things changing the way that human beings function in important and significant ways. And, for what it's worth, at the same time, the data is that individual human goals got much better on average, right? I mean, you could certainly argue that there were things that happened with industrialization that set back.
Goals got better.
Well, that people got healthier, that they,
achieved it.
stopped. Yeah, exactly. They stopped having accidents. They,
Okay.
they stopped being struck by lightning. Someone like Rosling has these long lists that are like that. So we do have a historical example of these superhuman intelligences happening, and it could have been what people thought at the time was that the effect of that was going to be that individual goals would be frustrated, and if you were trying to graze your sheep on the commons, then those individual goals you weren't better off as a result. But it certainly doesn't seem like there's any principle that says that what would happen is that the goals of the corporations, et cetera, would be misaligned. And
I think it's a matter of power balance. And so, certainly humans aren't powerless to influence those goals. And I think one of the things, though, that we may be toward tipping the balance, because a lot of technological things, I think, have helped enable the power of these very large corporations to coordinate and act and gather resources to themselves more than they've enabled the power of individuals to influence them.
Do you think that the research done?
Have
you finished your talk?
Well, I guess I have, yeah.
So I was going to go back to the East India Company, because I realized when I said that in fact, the East India Company did develop an information technology, and it became the education system of through elementary schools, of people being able to write uniformly, do calculations, arithmetic writing, enabled their information technology that individual clerks were substitutable across their whole operation. So they actually did.
Yeah, and in fact, and they did some pretty horrible things that were pretty against, I would say the East India Company did some pretty inhuman things.
So they weren't a counterexample thing, they're actually an example of what it is.
Al Gore made a really interesting comment. He said he viewed the Constitution as a program written for a distributed computer. Yeah. And it is a really interesting comment that if you take what you're saying seriously, to think about sort of what is the programming language.
Sure. It's legalese. Programming language is legalese.
I think that the algorithms of homophily are a huge part of the problem. The reputed echo chamber, that magnifies small differences, so you get conspiracy theories, which is a kind of the schizophrenic model is hyperconnectivity. Right? You have everything connects to this conspiracy theoretical model. So homophily, as I learned from Wendy Chung, is at its core of the programming language like begets like, as distinguished from the parallel study in the 50s of, birds of a feather don't flock together, difference attracts, right? So these were two models in the 50s that were at the core of this game theoretical, algorithmic thinking, and everyone went with like begets like, which produces the echo chamber. So the first question is about hybridity. So the DNA model has been radically complicated by translocation, right? So it's not the case that they're perfect clones, right? You mentioned 9 out of 10 E. coli, but there's the 1/10, which has information from the chimeric gene that I have floating around me from my son, when he was passing in my amniotic fluid, whatever, right? There's translocation going on all the time. So there's not this, in other words, do we have a resource there in this ongoing hybridization of the program? Do we have a resource, a point of inflection? And to Bob's rights comment, we also are giving rights, not we, but the Bolivian Constitution is giving rights to the ocean, to a tree, to cetaceans, right? So can this dialogue with others, with other life forms, with other sentiences, somehow break the kind of horrifying picture of the corporate superintelligence? Are there other translocatable, informational streams that can kind of be magnified, or the algorithms be switched to proliferate differences and dialogue and external influences rather than the continuous proliferation of the self-same? So,
first I'm going to say, I don't think it's necessarily horrifying, because I don't think we have no influence over this. So, I agree that this has been going on for a long time.
But we do have the model of a government being put in place by algorithms that we no longer control demographically.
Yeah.
We have an actual case.
Yeah, so, but the second thing is, I think that the question is, I think the trend is very much in the direction of the next level of organization, which is corporations, nation states, and things like that, actually taking advantage of these effects, like,
right.
Symbiosis,
That's called strategic partnerships.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Yes, it is. Acquisition of genetic material is done by acquisition. And, they have lots of ways of taking advantage of hybridization that is actually better than individuals. So, in fact, I think the technology has kind of hurt the individual interactions, as you point out, the way that it's played out. And in many ways harmed it. It's helped it in some ways. It's been a mixed bag. But I think it's definitely enabled the corporations, because the corporations before were limited just by the logistics of scale. So they became more and more inefficient, and except in very special cases, they couldn't hold together as they got bigger. Technology has given them the power to hold together and act effectively bigger and bigger, which is now why we've just gotten in the last year the first $2 trillion companies, because they were designed from the beginning to take good advantage of technology.
Do you think that there's a characteristic difference between the kind of research that goes on in under the corporate umbrella than university umbrella, say? I mean, I know people have lots of views about this, and there are things you can do in university you can't do in university, and in one and the other, but how would you characterize in particular areas of AI-related work?
I think corporations are much more rationally self-interested in how they focus their research.
You mean they're allocating resources more efficiently? They're choosing better. They're more effective at promoting promising research areas. Is that what you're suggesting?
They select research areas that increase that are in alignment with their emergent goals.
Yeah, but they're doing an additional thing now, which is very interesting, and they're taking the cream from the universities, offering them very open intellectual positions as a way of attracting the level below who will be more steerable to what they do. Right. So Google and Facebook are both doing this in the extreme at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's very smart of them, but I think that is an example of them.
Those particular people will tell you what great freedom they have.
So I think that's a great example of them being very smart and effective at channeling the energy toward their emergent goals. So Stephen has something.
Yes, so I'm curious, as you look at the emergent goals of corporations and so on, I mean, it's difficult to map how the goals of humans have evolved over the years, but I'm curious whether you can say anything about what you think the trend of emergent goals in corporations is. That is, what beyond kind of, if you talk about human goals, we can say something about how human goals have evolved over the last few thousand years, I think. I mean, some goals have remained the same, some goals have changed.
Yeah, I'll try my hand at it.
Yeah.
When there's a lot of operations in the same niche, they're competitive. When there get to be when there get to be two, they often become uncompetitive. So instead of if one is substantially bigger, it might try to destroy or gobble up the other one. But otherwise, it might try to cooperate with the other one against the interest of the consumer. It's called anti-trade. And also, as they get bigger, they also want to control their broader environment, like regulations. They have a small company is not going to, a restaurant's not going to try to control the regulation of restaurants. But if you have a huge chain, then you can try to control the governmental context in which you are. And you could also try to control the consumer side of it too. Advertising is a simple way to do that. As the corporations get bigger, I think there's an unfortunate tendency that the industrial competition goes down. And we see this in high tech. It's really very extreme. I mean, there's only 5 huge ones, and they're doing different things. I mean, Apple's doing manufacturing, and Amazon's not doing much manufacturing. And that's likely to continue, not just in the high-tech areas, but in others. And I think it's very worrisome that the corporations will get more and more resources to shape their own environment. And their goals are not just, at the lower level, and the restaurant or something, you have 2 goals. One is to make money for your owners, and the other is to survive. But when you get much bigger, it seems to me that often the goals are to beyond those 2, are to also control as much of your environment as you can.
For the purpose of stability or for further growth?
For both. And I think, and I think and there's another trend that's correlated with this, which is the concentration of capital. At the individual level, you see it, a higher and higher proportion of the wealth of a country is in the top 1%.
I think that's a symptom of them getting much more power the way we do ours.
Maybe. I think it's a symptom of the returns on capital greater than the growth of productivity, which doesn't depend so much on the level of organizational structure.
So you're attributing to
So I think it's going to get, it's good. So the corporations are likely to have more and more control over resources, and I think that's unfortunate. I think it's a very, very risky thing.
So it's kind of virtues and vices of corporations. Do you think the corporations will emerge with the same kinds of virtue and vice type goal structures that are attributed to humans?
Well, I'd say that Volkswagen's cheating.
I feel like we should have more people.
I'm just going to say one thing that Danny is very much Danny's work, and what he didn't say is that the world we inherited from the 1940s that brought the first Macy conferences, the huge competition was faster computers to break the code within 24 hours to design the bombs. These things were speed and what thinking machines was trying to do to get more instructions per second. But there's another side of it. There's slow computing that actually, in the end, for the survival of the species, and that's like where the immune system is so good because it's a very long-term memory, and we need that too. We don't just need the speed. And Danny, of course, is building the 10,000-year clock, the very, very slow computer. But that's an important thing because when you have these larger organizations, the super organizations you're talking about, they scale not only in size and distance, but in time. And that's a good thing because the corporations, or it can be a bad thing too. You can have a dictator that lasts for 1,000 years. But it's a very
corporations don't scale in time, though, right? That even when they get bigger, they seem to have a very predictable. They seem to have this very predictable life, right? That's what people like Jeff West.
Right, Jeffrey West will say that. But anyway, it's a very important, possibly good function of these systems as we love it. We're we're going to get longer term computing, where you look at the very long time series, and that evolutionary will be a good thing.
I mean, one question is, historically, we have places like AT&T, IBM, Xerox that had really world-class labs that over time deteriorated. I mean, AT&T Laboratories is nothing remotely like what it was like in the 1960s and 50s. And they expelled a lot of research eventually because it wasn't, short-term enough for them. And they figured they'd offload that to the universities, and then take the fruits of it and do things that were more short-term. So one possible outcome is that even the places where they're hiring people at a high level and giving a tranche of the research group relative freedom as a sort of cover and attractor, that one outcome is that could expand, but it could also pull back, and you could end up with, wrecking parts of the university and not having a lot of freedom in the corporation. I don't know. I just think that, it seems to me an open question what's going to happen with this concentration of research wealth at a few companies.
And I think the wealth is the important part. When AT&T Labs was riding high, AT&T was a monopoly of the phone company of the whole country, had incredible cash flow.
They were required by law to spend money.
But the fact is, I think basic research happens when there's a monopoly. Because if you have a monopoly, then it's worth your while to do basic research, because whatever is figured out will only benefit you. I mean, you see that even at the level of the US government.
Did you hear Frank's comment that AT&T was required by the government to do research?
Required by law to
right?
keep their profits at a certain level, so they spend so much on research.
Monopoly will never regulate itself.
And they put themselves out of business.
That is the definition.
But Stephen can still be right if that's correct. That doesn't
Even in our tiny corners of the technology world, it's worth our while to do basic research in things where we are the only distribution channel, basically. And the same thing is happening with a bunch of AI stuff that's being done in places where the only beneficiary is a company with a large distribution channel. That there's motivation to do basic research there. As soon as you remove that monopoly, the motivation to do basic research goes away from a sort of rational corporate point of view.
But I think there are cases where you can tie this very directly to AI. So the best example of this, I think, is the Facebook feed management algorithm. So that's a situation. So Nick Bostrom has this thought experiment about, machines that, you make an AI where the goal of the AI is to manufacture paper clips, and then it consumes the entire earth manufacturing paper clips. Tristan Harris has pointed out that the Facebook feed management algorithm is essentially that machine, but for human attention, where it consumes human attention, it makes money as a consequence of doing so. That's fed back into the mechanisms for consuming human attention. It gets better and better at consuming human attention until we've paperclipped ourselves.
That's true. That's true for all of these companies. And that's why I think we're in a kind of anybody who has teenage children knows that there's an attention problem out here. The attention deficit.
I would push back against that. Right? I mean, I think that idea is highly exaggerated, and let me give you the reason why I think that. If you think about walking down a street or driving down a street and having billboards around, if you were in a first-generation literate culture, what you would say is, there's this terrible problem. As you go down the street, every second what you're doing is having your attention distracted by having to decode what this stuff is, right? There's all these symbols, and you sit there and you decode the symbols, and you're not actually paying attention to anything that's going on the street. Your attention is terribly divided. And we know even neurologically that what actually happens is when you are deeply immersed in a literate culture, you end up with Stroop effects where your decoding of print isn't attention demanding in the same way. You're not doing it by serial attention anymore. In fact, you're doing it completely automatically and in parallel. It's just not. It's something that we all worry about because we're in the position of the pre-literate. We're in the position of the pre-literate person. It's not at all obvious that this is somehow an intrinsic characteristic.
But I think it's a real-time adversarial arms race. Right?
Can I bring this back to AI? I'd like to bring this back to the AI part of the comment rather than the social part of the comment, which is, I think that it's absolutely, that's a great example of right now, if you look at where artificial intelligence is being deployed on a large scale, where people are spending a lot of money paying the power bills for, doing the computation, things like that. They are mostly being done in the service of these kind of either corporations or nation states. Mostly corporations, but nation states are rapidly catching up on that. And they are making those more powerful and more effective at working their emerging goals. And I think that that is the way that this relates. So I think that when we think of these runaway AIs, I think we should think of them as not things off on themselves. They're the brains of these runaway things that are already these hybrid AIs. And so they're the artificial brains or the artificial nervous systems of these things that are already hybrid AIs and already have emerging goals of their own.
And so this is to say why I disagree with you about this. I mean, I feel kids these days, back in the 1960s, they're watching TV 5 hours a day, right? That's horrible. Though I enjoy preparing for the grumpy old man stage of my life, and I like practicing that. But I do think that if you look what these AIs are being devoted for, the primary use of them is to get people's attention to web pages.
Well, whether it's attention or dollars or votes, it really almost doesn't matter.
And the designers will tell you that they're using the lowest brainstem functions. That's part of the problem. They'll tell you they're racing to the bottom of the evolutionary channel as quickly as they can.
Yeah, if there's anything valuable that is valuable to them, they will use this power to get it. And, there will be there'll be problems with that, and there'll be limits on that, and so on. And you're pointing out some of the limits in getting attention, and there'll be limits in their ability to get money, and there'll be limits in their ability to get electric power, and and so on. But they will use all of these tools to get as much of it as they can.
But again, Danny, I mean, my challenge would be: is that any different than it was for Josiah Wedgwood in 1780?
Yes, it's a tip in power. So the
Why is it a tip in power when it? I mean, it seems to me you could argue there was much more of a tip in power if you're considering, 1710. You consider the difference between being around in 1730 and 1850,
because, for example, for the East India Company, they couldn't establish a policy and monitor that everybody did that policy.
But that's
Google can do that.
That's exactly what people like Wedgwood did, right? That was the whole part of the whole point of inventing factories was exactly doing that.
Right, but in fact they couldn't do it very effectively.
East India had to translate itself to a language with an army, which was the British Empire.
And
so there are meshes between corporations and governments that we really have to worry about, like the one we have right now.
So in between,
I'm not saying that we don't have to worry about that or there isn't power. What I'm saying is we have a historical. The question is, why is it that you think that this is a tipping point? All right, so it looks like there's this general phenomenon, which is that you develop these trans-individual superintelligences, and they have certain kinds of properties, and they tend to have power, and they have goals that are separate. All that's true, but we have a lot of historical evidence, and it might be that what's happening is that there's more of that than there was before. But why do you think that somehow it's a tipping point, that this is a point at which this is going to be different from...
I didn't say... there could be a tipping point. I'm not sure exactly now. What I am saying is that there's a rapid increase, there's an explosion of their intelligence. So these explosive technologies, which are driven by Moore's law and things like that, are being used to their advantage, not necessarily. There are very few examples where they're being used to individuals' advantage. There are lots of examples where they're being used to the advantage of these hybrid emergent intelligences.
That's a very good example, because between 1730 and 1850, the life expectancy and degree of nutrition and height of the average person in England declined.
No.
Because they were being taken out of the countryside and locked into factories for 90 hours a week.
So that's exactly why I think, there's historians here. That's why I think thinking about these historical examples is actually helpful. So if you think about the scaling difference between, let's say, pre-telegraph and train, right? So if you think about the difference in scale between the communication that you could have before you had the telegraph and afterwards, and before you had the train and afterwards. For all of human history, right? The fastest you could go was the fastest communication you could have was the speed of a fast horse. And then suddenly you have communication at the speed of light. It seems to me there's nothing that I can see in what is happening at the moment that's anything.
I realize what their difference is. I think of that as now. So when I'm thinking of when I'm saying this is happening now, I'm including railroads and telegraph, and I mean, this moment in history includes all of that. So that's the thing that's happening right now.
So that's industrialization. That's essentially industrialization. Industrialization.
I'm not categorized. I think industrialization focuses on the wrong aspect.
Telecommunications.
So a lot of things happen at once, and you categorize them, but. The particular thing that I think is interesting, which happened at the same time as industrialization, was the construction of an apparatus of communication of symbols and policies and things like that was outside the capacity of a human mind to follow. And I think that's the interesting thing, not the construction of there are many other aspects of industrialization. But I think that's the thing that's happening now, and I think computers and AI and things like that are just that going up on an exponential curve.
Right. And that's what I mean. I think seeing this moment of increased poverty and stagnation of wages for a big sector of society, an enormous increase of wealth within a concentrated group, and the consolidation of industries like Amazon and others is something that does represent the sharp edge of that increase. It's not just a simple linear continuation of what went before. I mean, in the post-World War II era, there was a sense that people were able, in families, to go to college for the first time, to get loans, at least if they were white, and that meant you had a big class that had increased expectations and increased income, and that's. We're seeing the echoes of what happens when that stops, when you're basically not bringing new people into the college system, you're not giving them increased stakes in homes and real estate and things that increase in value, and we're at a tough moment.
One argument that's often made by the technology companies is we're not doing anything different, right? This is something that's been done in the past, and we're just doing it better. But I think there actually is a case that you can make that doing it better is different. It's that, the objective function is the same, but you're doing a better job of optimizing it. And one consequence of that is that you get all of the unforeseen consequences of doing a good job of optimizing that objective function, which may not have been clear when you were doing a bad job of optimizing that function. So, in machine learning we talk about regularization, right? Regularization is forces that pull you back from overfitting on your objective. And you can think about, not being able to do a great job of optimizing as a form of regularization that was helping us to avoid all of the negative consequences of really optimizing the objective functions that those companies had defined for themselves.
Also, they say we're doing the same thing, but they also say we like to break stuff. And breaking stuff often means breaking
the social
the income of working class people.
Yeah, but it's enough that doing the same thing better is the thing that then reveals why it's bad to do that thing.
Yeah, you move everybody into half the people in the gig economy and take away their benefits. But it's fine.
So
why should they have to have a contract?
If you sort of go back to the other perspective and you say, okay, well, in a sense, is, let's say, a single cell better off being a part of a multicellular organism that they can't perceive, that's living in a society that they can't perceive. And I would argue that it's a mixed bag, but generally they are.
Yeah, right, that's right.
And so I'm actually kind of optimistic in that sense.
I mean, if you think the train and the telegraph is the inflection point, rather than, the last 10 years is the inflection point, I think it's pretty hard to make, with the proviso that, people are off of the commons and there's pollution and tuberculosis and all the rest. I think the data are that if you think of the train and telegraph as an inflection point, that the individual achievement of goals didn't just get better, but got exponentially better
So, but I think of this, again, I'm not saying there's an inflection point. I think that we're going through a transition. And so we're in the middle of a transition from going from one level of organization to another level of organization.
What if we
In
ask
that
Lenin's
process,
questions?
Yeah, but for instance, individual cells had to give up the ability to reproduce. They had to, they had to delegate it to. That was a big, So I think we will lose some things in that process.
No, I think that's right.
I think we will lose some things in that process. We'll gain some things in that process. But I'd really like, all I'm mostly arguing for is we don't have to hype it. I think we're spending too much time worrying about the hypothetical.
Right.
And
No,
it'd be better to actually look at the actual.
The most important thing that's happening in this century is China getting rich. Everything else to me is secondary.
That's where I started too.
Can I just say that, the description of the state of things, but then to ask what is to be done, as it were. And one aspect of humanizing, let's call them robots, AI, whatever you like, would be to tax them as humans. Especially when they replace workers in factories or accountants or white-collar jobs and all the pattern recognition professions. Then we would all have a stake.
But see, that's an example where we may have passed a tipping point, which is that the corporations are now politically powerful enough to keep their tax rates low.
Yeah.
And not only that, but the billionaires are powerful enough to keep their tax rates low, for example, inheritance tax.
And this is what I think we need to resist, the point at which, perhaps in 50 years' time, vast sections of the population are only going to be working 10 or 15 hours a week. And we might have to learn from aristocracies of how to use leisure, how to hunt, how to fish, how to play the harpsichord. In other words, it's perfectly possible, and anyone who speaks of retirement, and we were talking about this in a break, how busy you can be doing nothing. But somehow we have to talk of distributing wealth and function here.
That's the next conference.
But I think Bob's point is, this is a sense in which it really, the rubber meets the road, where it's actually taxing corporations. That window is passed. We've lost that.
Yeah.
They now have more power than individuals do in influencing the political system. So there's an example of, where the train has left the station. We're now in a post-individual human world. We're now in a world that is controlled by these emerging goals of the corporations. And I don't think there's any turning back the clock on that. I think we are now in that